So we can resume our session, and the first speaker is John Curtis, Layard's relationship with F.C. Cooper and his other artists.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. First, I'd like to record my thanks for the invitation from Stefano Emidoro. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in these wonderful surroundings. And I'm going to talk about Layard's relationship with Cooper and with his other artists. Just a few basic facts to start with. Layard's first excavation campaign at Nimrud and Nineveh was from 1845 to 1847, and he had with him as a helper Hormuz Rassam, the younger brother of the British vice-consul. And Hormuz was just 17 years old when they started work, and his job was to act as Layard's secretary and pay the workmen, but in fact, as we'll see, he did very much more than this. Well, in his first campaign at Nimrud, the main focus of attention was on the northwest palace of Ashurnasirpal, but also in this first season, as we've heard from Andrew George, Layard opened trenches in the Kuyunjik mound at Nineveh and cleared some chambers in the southwest palace of Sennacherib. Well, the results of this first campaign were written up with exemplary speed, appearing already in 1849, and a large the account of the excavations in Nineveh and its remains, and this was accompanied by a large folio volume of drawings, monuments of Nineveh, published in the same year. Now, Layard, during this first campaign, had no artists with him, so most, if not all, of the drawings in this first series of monuments of Nineveh were from his own hand. And there's no question, but this was a very remarkable achievement. Layard himself was an accurate copyist and a good draftsman, and while he spent not much time making sketches and watercolors, or if he did, they didn't survive, he made very faithful copies of the Assyrian reliefs and monuments. But it was clear to everybody that this situation couldn't continue. However brilliant he may have been, he couldn't be expected to manage the excavations and all the recording and drawing. So it was therefore agreed that a young artist should be engaged for the second season, and this was a young 28-year-old man called Frederick Charles Cooper, who was signed up for the sum of £200 a year for the journey. Now, it might not seem very much, and Layard is constantly complaining about the amount of money he received, but you have to multiply these figures by something around 200, something like that. So, in fact, it's not an insubstantial amount of money that he was promised, £40,000 for the year. Well, as it turned out, Cooper wasn't an ideal choice, as he had no experience of travelling in the East, and he didn't acclimatise well. However, he presumably needed the money, and he was nothing if not willing. And we can actually work out quite a lot about him because, A, we have his portfolio of drawings in the British Museum, although it's not entirely clear which drawings are actually by him. We have 28 new drawings that were acquired in 2009. We have his diary for the period 1850. And we have, of course, reports and comments about him by his contemporaries. Well, the second excavation campaign lasted from September 1849 until May 1851. And as the members of this expedition and their relations with each other are crucial to the Cooper story, I'm going to say a little bit about them. Apart from Cooper himself, of course, there was Layard. There was Hormuz Rassam, and there was Dr. Humphrey Sandwith, who was a young English surgeon whom Layard had met in Constantinople and persuaded him to join the excavation. But in the event, he proved to be more interested in field sports than in archaeology, and he didn't provide very much help. Well, Layard, Rassam, Cooper and Sandwith left Constantinople on the 28th of August 1849, and they arrived in Mosul on the 30th September. And towards the end of the year, they were joined by Stuart Erskine Rolland and his wife Charlotte. And the Rollands had been travelling in the east and were on their way to visit Colonel Williams of the Boundary Commission. In Mosul, providing intermittent help and hospitality, were Hormer's elder brother, the British Vice-Consul Christian Rassam, and his wife Matilda, and her brother, the English missionary George Percy Badger, and his wife Maria. I'm telling you something about these people for reasons that you will see in a moment. Now, George Percy Badger was a rather intransigent Anglo-Catholic missionary and an Oriental scholar who'd returned to Mosul earlier in 1850 so that he could research his book on the Nestorians and their rituals that appeared a couple of years later. During this second season, Layard himself worked mainly at Nimrud, and he lived there in a small mud brick house, and the Rollands stayed with him there until they left. But the bulk of the work during this second season was at Nineveh, and that was where Cooper was based, together with Hormer's Rassam. He, Cooper, lived in Mosul and rode out each day to the Kiyunjik Mound, and worked mainly, as you heard, in the southwest palace of Sennacherib. And during the reliefs that were uncovered during that second season were the siege and capture of Lachish, a campaign in the marshes, and the quarrying and transportation of winged bulls for the palace. Well, during this time, Cooper was very busy copying reliefs. There's no doubting that. So on the 18th of March, 1850, Layard was able to report to Sir Henry Ellis, the director of the British Museum, that Mr. Cooper has made about 60 drawings at Kuyunjik and Nimrud, many of them very elaborate and full of subject, containing as many as 200 figures. So that ought to mean that 60 drawings at least among the original drawings in the British Museum are actually by Cooper, and obviously many more than that. And earlier, Layard had asked the British Museum to send 100 sheets of silver paper for the protection of Mr. Cooper's drawings. And Cooper was also responsible for supervising the workmen at Kuyunjik, and in a draft letter to his wife Louisa, he describes a dangerous incident on the Kuyunjik Mound when a massive fight broke out amongst the workmen. A Rassam was sent for, Hormer's Rassam that is, but before Rassam had arrived, Cooper had managed to sort things out. Well, there's no doubt that Cooper's output was very considerable, and many of the drawings published in the second series of Monuments of Nineveh are certainly by Cooper. Well, let's look at a few of them. Here's a winged genie from the southwest palace. This is a file of captives from a campaign in Babylonia. I must say that it needs very much more work and analysis on these original drawings. There's 6 volumes of original drawings in the British Museum, and an art historian needs to look at them very carefully indeed to work out exactly who did which. But I think there's no doubting that this and a number of others are by Cooper. This certainly is by Cooper, and everybody acknowledges that. Well, he also did a number of watercolour sketches showing the excavations at Nineveh, and 2 of these are amongst the new drawings that have been acquired. This is Layard here, no mistaking him, wearing a peaked cap. He always appears in the drawings and watercolours in this same cap. And he's got under his arm a red book, which undoubtedly must be Nineveh and its remains. Here's another watercolour of Cooper's, showing a Tiari workman at Nineveh. These Tiari workmen were actually Nestorians from the Tiari Mountains, and they wore striped dresses and conical felt caps. And I'll be saying something a bit later about the two tiny figures at the end of this tunnel. This is a watercolour which Andrew's already showed us of excavations in progress at Björnjik. It's actually in the BM, not the BL, I think, this one. And this is a watercolour of Cooper's showing the different workmen, and I think it must be the third one from the right must be the foreman Tomar, which has already been described by Andrew. Well, from time to time, Cooper was also sent to Nimrud. This is a very famous watercolour showing, well, you can see Layard in the peak cap standing on the top of the bulk there, supervising the operation. It's the removal of the winged lions, which proved to be a very difficult exercise. I'll be saying something about this in a moment. This watercolour been in the BM for a long time. It's the so-called Room of the Bronzes at Nimrud, where the Nimrud bowls were found, plus a lot of bronze cauldrons, furniture, and horse harness fittings. The room is, of course, we know it's that room, of course, because of the well that's depicted here. Here's another Cooper watercolour, which is already in the BM. This is the entrance to the shrine of Ninurta at Nimrud, built by Ashurnatsipal. And this is the entrance to the shrine of Ishtar, to winged lions. And this is acknowledged to be by Cooper. It's a lithograph which is in Nineveh and Babylon, but I think we haven't got the original, or at least I don't know where it is. Here's an example of works by Cooper which are not acknowledged. This is in Nineveh and Babylon. They're sketches of excavations along the base of a stone wall. In fact, it's by the ziggurat, and we know that this was by Cooper only because Layard wrote to Ellis, the director of the British Museum, on the 18th March 1850, saying that Cooper has made sketches of the stone wall discovered, etc. Then, in the period 21st March to 5th of May, the whole party, all of the people that I talked about to start with, left Mosul for an extended trip to the River Habur and to inspect various sites, but particularly Tel Arban, where some stone lions were known to have been found. And this is Cooper's sketch of the expedition camp at Tel Arban. All of these watercolours now I'm going to show you are amongst the newly acquired 28 watercolours. This is a Bedouin encampment, the so-called black tents, and in the far distance is the range of mountains known as Jebel Abdul Aziz. Then here are tents of, they're called, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this actually, Chichi. They spell it C-H-I-C-H-I, Kurds. These are black tents belonging to this Kurdish tribe. And this is the tent of the chief of that tribe. Some sort of audience going on. So you can see that Layard and his party are seated on the rug in the foreground, And again, we can see that Layard is there wearing his peaked cap. These are people they encountered during this expedition to the Habor. The Sheikh and his sons at the top left. The one at the bottom left is an identified person, Muhammad Amin. He's the chief sheikh of the Jabur tribe. And on the right is a dervish holding a spear. Then there's three Kurdish women on the left wearing wonderful Bedouin jewellery. And on the right there's a sketch which is entitled Lamentation. You can see that sadly there's a dead person lying on a couch in front of the a tent. This is a minaret at Sinjar. And on the right, there's some of the Roman ruins at Beled Sinjar. So this is all still in this 6-week trip to the Habor. Then here we've got the volcanic, well, it's an extinct volcano called Kokab, but it's a landmark which is visible from many miles in northeastern Syria. And on the right is a cemetery in the vicinity of Kokab. Then here we've got, it's a castle which Layard talks about quite a lot in Nineveh Babylon, called Bash Kala, high up on a hill, an impregnable castle on the right. And then just to finish this series, this is a view of Lake Hatunia, which is published in Nineveh and Babylon, and it is acknowledged as being by him. But I don't know where the original is. Well, so far, we've given every impression that Cooper was an exemplary member of the expedition. So why did Layard write about him in the following terms? This is what he wrote to Sir Stratford Canning. Neither of these gentlemen, that's Cooper or Sandwith, were at all qualified for an expedition of this kind, and I have received little or no assistance from them. And then, a bit later, he wrote to Ellis, the director of the British Museum, from Mosul now, Mr. Layard left me, as you have probably heard, at Van. He was quite unequal in every way to an expedition of this kind. So what went wrong? Well, from the start, it's clear that Layard was fairly contemptuous of Cooper and had little time for him. I mean, it is true that Cooper was very homesick. He greatly missed his wife, and he left her behind when she was heavily pregnant. And while he was out in Mesopotamia, he painted a portrait of her from memory and brought it out constantly and looked at it. And Rassam has written somewhere, if I ever get married, I hope I love my wife as much as he does. Another thing about Cooper was he didn't like the local food, and he suffered from the climate when it started to get hotter. Well, it's evident, I mean, these are perhaps reasons for Layard to be slightly annoyed with Cooper, but not very much more. But in his diary entries, I have to say, he's fairly openly contemptuous. Like, he talks, for example, when they're moving the colossal winged lions. I showed you Cooper's sketch of that. And Layard has written in his diary, the workmen get all manner of notions into their heads. At one time they declared that Mr. Cooper was unlucky. He was ordered to leave, and the cart immediately progressed. Well, the truth of the matter with this is probably that the workmen did not like Cooper, the artist, making a sketch of them moving a graven image. It's nothing to do with their thinking that Cooper was unlucky. Then we got another entry here in March 1850. This is on the trip to the Harbour, when they're passing through a ravine, and Layard writes, "We entered a deep river gorge and soon began to ascend the hill by a very rapid and rather difficult ascent. Mr. Cooper was the only one of our party who met with any disaster. He found himself off the tail of his horse, saddle and all, struggling with the hind legs of the animal." And then a bit later, when they're in the Harbour, they visit a Bedouin encampment, and Layard talks about the children there, who he calls dirty urchins, these children, and one of them was thought to have had a similarity and likeness with Mr. Cooper, and he was then christened the Musawa, the artist, because he had some kind of fair complexion. So beyond this obvious personal dislike that Layard had for Cooper, there were deeper reasons, and I'm coming back now to what I started to talk about at the beginning. First of all, there was the business with the Rollands. Now, initially, Cooper enjoyed good relations with both of the Rollands, and of Charlotte, he later recorded, "She's the only person who's given me the slightest assistance, copying inscriptions, notes, manuscripts, etc." And we know that she also helped packing the antiquities, and in fact Cooper refers to that in his diary. And Stuart Rolland, although he was more interested in horses than in archaeology, does seem to have some extent helped on the excavations. But in fact, Layard was rather more than friendly with Charlotte Rolland, and it seems almost certain that he had some sort of an affair with her. And it can't have been helped that Cooper had bad relations with the Rollands, but in his diary for 10th of March 1850, he refers to the Rollands, with whom I am not on good terms, owing to his arrogance and her little mischief-making tongue. Well, in the event, there was a lot of trouble with the Rollands during the Harbour trip. The relations between Layard and Charlotte were sufficiently intimate to incite Rolland's jealousy, and it can't have helped, for example, that Charlotte was accustomed to riding behind Layard on his camel and spent long hours in his tent alone with him. And on their return to Mosul, relations were tense, and Rolland exploded and started to beat his wife. They were actually separated by Layard and others, but the next day they were asked by Layard, he didn't have any choice obviously, to leave the excavation. And subsequently Layard, in a letter to Sarah Austin, described Stuart Rolland, his erstwhile friend, who he thought rather a lot of in the first place. He now describes him as one of the most selfish, ill-bred, unfeeling and conceited men I have ever met. Well, secondly, this is the second reason for Layard's dislike of Cooper. Cooper spent a lot of time in Mosul socializing with Christian and Matilda Rassam and with the Reverend George Percy Badger and his wife Maria. And obviously Layard didn't approve of this, partly because of their attitude towards Charlotte. Matilda and her husband, the George Percy Badger, certainly didn't approve of her. And in a letter to Ross, Layard wrote, "The Badgers and Rassam have acted most infamously towards Charlotte. After all I've done for the Rassams, I confess I'm astonished at the manner in which Mrs. Rassam has acted. Although after the unprincipled acts which we both know her jealous and vindictive temper led her to commit, I might have expected anything. And in the same letter, Layard describes old Rassam, this is Christian Rassam, as a donkey. And again, in another letter, Mrs. Rassam has behaved very unkindly to her, all the fault of those cursed badgers who are a regular pest. There was actually another reason for Layard's dislike of the badgers, and that is that he and Badger were in dispute about who discovered Nimrud and about their respective relations with the Nestorians. But his description of old Rassam as a donkey is hard to explain away. Christian Rassam was one of the leading merchants in Mosul. He'd been appointed British vice-consul in 1839, and as I said, he was married to George Percy Badger's sister. But Layard was very greatly in Rassam's debt, as Rassam had been instrumental, I think Andrew mentioned this, in enabling him to start excavations in the first place. And in order not to attract unwelcome attention, excavating tools were supplied by Christian Rassam, who managed a building business, and he, Layard, and Rassam's business partner, Henry James Ross, went to Nimrud on the pretense of going on a hunting trip. And I think it's worth recording here that Layard doesn't really acknowledge the great help that he owed to the Rassam family, Christian and Hormuzd. Without them, he probably wouldn't have been able to work at all. And Layard's antipathy towards Christian Rassam must have made things pretty difficult for Hormuzd. He's been described as Layard's secretary and paymaster, but he was clearly very much more than this, and his services, I think, were clearly indispensable. And this is what Humphrey Sandwith says about him. That's Hormuz Rassam's duties are multifarious. He acts as interpreter and secretary. He marshals the servants, keeps the money bags, speaks all the unknown languages, and keeps us all amused. This impression that he was very much Layard's major domo and that he was very dependent on him is confirmed by entries in Cooper's diary. So on the 1st of April, when the party arrived at Tel Arban, Cooper records that Layard was not able to start excavating until Rassam had hired and organized the necessary workmen. And as we know, after Layard's departure, Hormuz Rassam worked with great success at Kuyunjik from 1852 to 1854, and later in Mesopotamia, finding an enormous amount of material, but his only I think the only problem with him is that he found stuff, but he didn't record it properly. Well, now I showed you this on what you got here. Yes, that's right. I showed you this this watercolor before. The figure on the top of the bulk is very definitely Layard wearing the peak cap, but I'm pretty certain that the figure next to him wearing the red fez is actually Hormuz Rassam. And he appears very often alongside Layard in other paintings, but here in this one you'll see that the figure at the end of the tunnel is clearly the same person, and again I think this must be Rassam. Well, originally it had been decided that Layard should stay in Mesopotamia till 1851, but that wasn't to be. As the excavations continued into July, on the 9th of July, in order to apparently escape the murderous summer heat, Layard sent Cooper into the mountains to the monastery of Mar Mattai, and the intention was that after a midsummer break, Cooper should return to Mosul with Layard and Rassam. According to Layard's account, Mr. Cooper had so much declined in health that I sent him to the convent of Mar Mattai. Mr. Hormuz Rassam and myself struggle on the longest. So how much longer did they stay? From Rassam's account, one might have assumed several weeks at least. In fact, it was just 2 days. and Layard and Rassam left on the 11th of July. And according to Cooper's diary, on the 9th of July, it was Layard who was suffering from a high fever, and he suggested that to avoid getting it, he, Cooper, should go to the convent. So, on the 2nd of August, the party arrived at Vannes, by which time perhaps Cooper was indeed very ill, I don't know, but in any case, Layard decided then that Cooper and Sandwith shouldn't return to Mosul, and so he sent them on to Constantinople. Well, although Layard does acknowledge the contribution of Cooper in his introduction to Monuments of Nineveh, he makes no mention at all of Cooper in the preface to Nineveh and Babylon. He does thank Hormuz Rassam, and amongst others, the Reverend Malan, who Andrew has talked about earlier, who has kindly allowed me the use of his masterly sketches, but in fact there are 20 drawings in Nineveh and Babylon actually attributed to Cooper, and at least 5, and I'm sure more, which are not attributed at all. By contrast, only 16 drawings of Malan have been reproduced. And here are examples of Cooper's drawings that are included in Nineveh and Babylon without any acknowledgement. These are all drawings that we've already looked at. As I said, at least 5, and I think probably a lot more. This is another Cooper drawing, which is not actually in Layard's Nineveh and Babylon. It's actually in the book by Joseph Bonomi called Nineveh and Its Palaces, but also it appears here unattributed. Well, what of Cooper as an artist? The art historian H.L. Malalieu has written in his Dictionary of British Watercolour Artists up to 1920, Cooper's landscapes are effective, but his figures can be rather shaky. Which may be true. I'm not an art historian, so I'm not really in a position to judge that. But more damning, he says that Layard seems to have taken credit for some of Cooper's better work. However that may be, Cooper left behind him a substantial body of work, and I think we can conclude that he's been roughly treated by posterity, largely because of Layard's animosity towards him. I mean, some of his sketches have become almost iconic. This is a view of Mosul from the with Nebi Yunus in the foreground. I should have made the point actually that Cooper did do multiple sketches. That's why so many of his works survive, and in some cases there are very similar ones now in different institutions. And interestingly, this is a book of British stamps which was issued about 15 years ago or so, and this is obviously derived from the sketch that we've seen about Cooper, but of course here he's not acknowledged. Well, what of Cooper after Nimrud, after Assyria? It's first of all we should make the point that he remained on good terms with Hormuz Rassam, and he painted these 2 portraits of Rassam in London in 1852. Then, as you might expect, in his preface to the Nestorians and their rituals, George Percy Badger is fulsome about Cooper and what he did for Layard and what he did for Badger, actually arranging and organizing all the illustrations in Badger's book. I don't think the originals of these are by Cooper, but at least the lithographs are, as you can see from the attributions in the bottom left corner. And Badger also talks about Cooper's diorama of Nineveh. What was this? Well, it seems that for some years after he came back, Cooper travelled the country with what was called a diorama, which was a series of enormous paintings which were put up around the rooms of the lecture hall, and then he would talk about the excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh. And you see here from this letter, which quite recently came into my hands actually, that he was selling his services or giving the lectures for the price of £7 10 shillings, which, as I said before, you should probably multiply by something like 200 to get an accurate price of how much he was charging for these lectures. This one was in 1856. We have mention of him up till 1860, when he exhibited again at the Royal Academy with a painting called the Plains of Nineveh. After that, I don't know what happened to him, and he died in 1880. I'm rather running out of time, so I'll go quickly over the remaining artists. The next one was Thomas Septimus Bell, who didn't last very long, and he sadly drowned in the River Gommel at Babian without apparently having done very much work. This sketch on the left is generally attributed to him, but I'm not absolutely certain that it is by him, because the watercolour on the right, which is very similar and could be derived from the one on the left, is actually by Cooper. So Bell, as I say, sadly drowned on the 13th May 1851, and he was replaced in due course by another artist called Charles Doswell Hodder, who came out to Assyria actually after Layard had left. So Layard and Hodder did not interact at all on the excavations. Now, Layard is very also contemptuous about Hodder and thought very little of his work, but some of it actually is extremely valuable. This, for example, is a mosaic which he's done of the Lakish frieze, which, as you can see, was in lots of tiny fragments, and it would have been impossible to reconstruct it in the British Museum after removal if somebody hadn't done this detailed recording work, and that's what Hodder did. And he also drew or redrew, this is also the Siege of Lachish, some scenes from earlier reliefs which either hadn't been recorded or hadn't been recorded well enough, some of them at Nimrud. Well, just to complete the picture, I just want to talk about, refer to one other artist, painter. He's called Edward Prentice, and he was a genre painter who'd already been used to paint some of the ivories that Layard had found at Nimrud. Perhaps Georgina Herrmann will talk to us about that. But amongst the things that he did in the British Museum was record about 50 or 60 of the Nimrud bowls found in that room of the bronzes. And he made absolutely wonderful and very faithful and accurate watercolour copies of the bowls. The one on the left is the watercolour, and on the one on the right is the original, now in the there's another example of Prentice's work. The only other person I should mention is an engraver called Ludwig Grunner, who again is not as well known as he should be, but I understand there's actually somebody researching him at the moment, and we shall hear more about him in due course. And he's the person that made the engravings, at least for the second volume of Monuments of Nineveh. Well, just to conclude, we've considered in some detail the artists who worked with or for Layard, but what of Layard himself? Was he a genius? Yes, I think he was, on 3 counts: as an archaeologist, as an historian, and as a writer. In terms of archaeological understanding, he was far ahead of his time. He had an excellent grasp of ancient and modern history, and he was able to write with great flair. And he was also exceptionally energetic and industrious. However, he was very loath to give people proper credit, to those people who worked with him. His treatment of Cooper was highly reprehensible, I think, and he never fully acknowledged the help that he had from the 2 Rassin brothers, Christian and Hormuzd. Without them, he probably wouldn't have been able to excavate at all. Thank you.
And now we come to the last paper of this morning by Georgina Herrmann. And the title of this paper is Henry Layard, Nimrud's First Archaeologist and His Ivories.
On right, whichever one works. Not Beirut, you see.
Venice.
Venice, yes. First of all, it's a real honour to have been invited to this celebration of the bicentenary of the birth of Austin Henry Layard. Let me begin by saying that he is my hero, despite everything that Dr. Curtis has been saying about him. He was such an incredible dynamic young person that I think we can accept that everyone of such power and genius would have found anyone helping him totally substandard. I consider Layard as one of the most remarkable men in the history of the archaeology of the ancient Near East. He was not only a pioneer, the first to start digging at Nimrud, but was arguably the finest archaeologist working there, not only in the 19th century, which is without doubt, but in the 20th century as well, which is rather shaming. Let's put it in context. Layard had an unusual and incredibly valuable upbringing in Florence, where he met a wide range of people: poets, painters, writers, antiquaries, and travelers. Father, a connoisseur of Italian painting, taught his son about the great masters. He also was in contact with Morelli, about whom we'll hear more tomorrow. He was taught how to distinguish one artist's hand from another, and also he learned to draw, all of which were to prove to be of fundamental importance in his work at Nimrud. He read widely and was much influenced to the very end of his life by his favorite book, The Arabian Nights. And I'm sure many of you will have been inspired to travel to the Orient through poems like James Elroy Flecker. After this exotic beginning, at the age of 16, articled as a clerk to his uncle in London, and unsurprisingly hated it. A young man with a thirst for adventure, and in 1839 he set off with a friend to travel on horseback to Ceylon, where he hoped to find more congenial work. Two young men were delighted by the landscape, classical ruins, and the early Christian churches in Asia Minor. They then travelled on to visit Jerusalem and Layard to visit Petra. They finally reached Mosul at the beginning of April in 18. Then they visited the ruins of the great Assyrian cities of Nineveh, Ashur, and Mosul. As Layard wrote, the lines of Assyria made a deeper impression upon me, gave rise to more serious thoughts and earnest reflection than the temples of Baalbek and the theatres of Ionia. Hangs over Assyria, Babylonia, and Chaldea. Great nations and great cities shadowed forth in history. Mighty ruins in the midst of deserts, defying by their very desolation, lack of definite form, the description of the traveller. Remnants of the mighty races still roving over the land, filling and fulfillment of prophecies, plains to which the Jew and the Gentile alike look as the cradle of their race. Layard also describes his first sight of Nimrud. I'm afraid I haven't got a really good photograph of this. This is just a Google. And he writes, "It was evening as we approached the spot. The spring rains had clothed the mound with the richest verdure, and the fertile meadows which stretched around it were covered with flowers of every hue. Amidst this luxuriant vegetation were partly concealed fragments of brick, pottery, and alabaster, upon which might be traced the well-defined wedges of the cuneiform character. Not these remains mark the nature of the ruin, might have been confounded with a natural eminence. Long line of consecutive narrow mounds, still retaining the appearance of walls or ramparts, stretched from its base and formed a large quadrangle. My curiosity had been greatly excited, and from that time I formed the design of thoroughly examining, whenever it might be in my power, these mighty ruins." It was 5 years before Layard was able to fulfill his start work at Nimrud. was, of course, totally untrained. There were no institutes of archaeology, nor Mortimer Wheeler to instruct him on stratification. There was nothing to give him guidance, which makes his achievements all the more remarkable. On the 8th of November 1845, with the help of the Rassam brothers of Mosul and the English Ivories, Layard hired a raft and floated down the river. The countryside was in a desperate state. Most of the villages were deserted, the local tribes having been crushed by the Pasha. Staying overnight in a hovel, they enlisted the help of a local sheikh, Awad, and asked him to find some workmen. They started work the next day. On the very first day, his team followed a line of alabaster slabs, built a small room in what proved to be the Northwest Palace, which you can see on the center left. On the second day, in the rubbish at the bottom, they found the first small consignment of ivories, which included a bearded male, a sphinx, and part of a lion or lioness. Now, I think something that hasn't been brought out about Layard was that many archaeologists would go and dig a site, but few have this incredible thing of luck, of good fortune, which followed him. How many archaeologists, starting in that enormous site, would have found a room straight away and in the bottom of it found the very first ivories? Layard's principal finds were, of course, not the ivories, but the great Lamassu figures and the carved reliefs surrounding the principal rooms of the palace, all of which he recorded and drew. And here I think it's really essential. This is just the plan of what Layard himself discovered at Nimrud of the Northwest Palace. It does not include all the later excavations. But you can see in this plan that all the slabs that he discovered were numbered. Again, this was the mid-1840s or late 1840s, and to have actually worked to such precision was something totally unusual, and to have drawn them. He also found many small antiquities, especially in his treasure chamber, or room of the bronzes, which John has referred to. However, his principal discovery of ivories was in rooms V and W, which you can see in red at the bottom left. This was part of the king's suite. And interestingly, after Andrew's talk, this room, room V, was the bathroom. So once again, we're finding a bathroom reused as a storeroom, which is clearly what this was. Uniquely for his time, and also nowadays, Layard recorded exactly where he found them. They had been dropped in the doorway between rooms V and W, or within room V. And again, you can see things, the slabs marked. Any of those found in the doorway consist of two sets of a similar size, style, and methods of fixing. Many ivories are worked as matching sets, so you'll find half a dozen that are similar. And as already suggested first by Layard and later by Richard Barnett, the two sets probably form parts of a single decorative scheme on a bit of furniture. One set showed 6 young pharaoh figures saluting plants, 3 facing to the right and 3 to the left, and the other showed women at the window. Some of the panels had Aramaic letters, or what are often known as fitters' marks, incised either on their backs, as on the panel on the screens, or on the front of the tenons. The purpose of these marks is disputed. It's usually thought that they indicated the position of the ivories in a reassembled panel. However, the situation is more complex than that. Not only are such marks not ubiquitous, but of course their preservation and or recording is very variable. They may indeed have been position markers, as Professor Alan Millard thinks. He worked on all the marks that we've published in the Ivories from Nimrud volumes. Or they may have indicated the output of a particular workshop, or it's possible they were just random. However, there's one example which may suggest a possible solution, at least for the ivories from the room VW doorway. Once again, it's Layard's superb recording which is crucial. Oh, that's showing the... I might want to go back one. Because we have not only the well-preserved panels with their marks available for study in the British Museum, but we know where they were found. Two of the young pharaoh figures facing right, that one, had similar marks on their backs. It was a form of the letter Gemel. The back of the third panel was not preserved. Of the pharaoh figures facing left, two had different marks on the fronts of their tenons, as you can see down at the bottom. In the third example, the tenon had broken off. So you've got panels to left and right with different marks. Significantly, there are subtle differences of style between the two sets of pharaohs, those facing right and left. If you look at them, you'll see that, for instance, the one on the left, facing left, I'm always dodgy on lefts and rights, is quite a slim chap, and he doesn't have a tail down the back. The one on the right is quite portly, with a tail down his back. The position of their hands is different, and there are so many other differences. One has a fillet hanging from the form of Egyptian crown, the other doesn't. You can go through it one by one and note that they're very different. But all the ones from the left are similar, and all the ones from the right are similar. This reinforces the evidence of the marks on their backs or tenons and suggests that they were carved by different hands. The same pattern is repeated on the panels with women at the window, and also some of the individual heads from such panels. Three of them have gimel marks on their backs and can be compared stylistically to the gimel pharaohs. Alan would be much more precise on the form of the Aramaic letters than I am, and I'm being brief. A fragmentary set of openwork cows and calves was also found in the room, one of which has a gimel mark on its back and probably formed part of this same piece of furniture. These panels are unique in being stylistically similar, found together, and fully recorded. Unfortunately, this is the only group that I have identified so far where it is possible you may be able to identify specific craftsmen who can be identified not only by difference of style, which you can isolate on many individual panels, but with this style backed up by the maker's marks. These panels, together with many of the others found in the room, belong to a single style group, which is Syro-Phoenician, wig and wing group. Sorry about the technical term. Syro-Phoenician ivories make use of Phoenician designs. They don't use any different designs, but carve them in squat, un-Phoenician proportions. Also found in the doorway between rooms V and W were some superb Phoenician ivories. These are among the most beautiful ivories found at Nimrud, with elegant proportions and a superb sense of balance. They're also the most technically sophisticated of all those found at Nimrud, and they also made a great use of very fine and elegant inlays and overlaying with gold. Recent analysis of the huge corpus of ivories found at Nimrud, published in the last Ivories from Nimrud volume, has established that by far the majority of the ivories belong to the Phoenician tradition. Not surprisingly, since there are so many Phoenician ivories, well over 1,000 examples, there are a number of different style groups within it. One of these was so strongly influenced by the art of Egypt that they are called Egyptianizing. This well-known panel, together with a similar fragment, shows two deities seated either side of a central cartouche, surmounted by a sun disk and artif feathers. Highlighted with colour, with overlays of gold foil and inlays of blue glass set over a layer of Egyptian blue. Thanks to his early tuition in Florence, Layard had an exceptionally acute eye, which was evident in his description of this Egyptianizing ivory. Recognized that the forms and style of art have a purely Egyptian character, although there are certain peculiarities in the execution and mode of treatment that would seem to mark the work of a foreign artist. And indeed, the Egyptologist who worked with me on the ivory volumes also said that the Egyptianizing ivories, while clearly dependent on the art of Egypt, were non-Egyptian. Room V in the King's Suite presumably originally served as a bathroom, but by the 8th century had clearly been converted into a storeroom, as happened in Kuyunjuk for the tablets. The presence of ivories in the doorway and in room W suggests they were being moved from the room V and then dropped, presumably when the palace was sacked. It's noteworthy that the ivories Layard found in these rooms all belonged either to the Phoenician or to the Syro-Phoenician traditions of ivory carving. There were no Assyrian ivories there. These are mostly confined to elite Assyrian areas such as throne rooms, and there were no North Syrian either. Perhaps it's worth reflecting at this moment about the problems Layard had, not only in finding the ivories, but in raising and conserving them. Layard described how the ivories adhered so firmly to the soil and were in so forward a state of decomposition that I had the greatest difficulty in extracting them, even in fragments. I spent hours lying on the ground, separating them with a penknife from the rubbish by which they were surrounded. Those who saw them when they first reached this country will be aware of the difficulty of releasing them from the hardened mass in which they were embedded. The ivory separated itself in flakes. Even the falling away of the earth was sufficient to reduce it almost to powder. Similar problems were encountered by the Malouin's Nimrud expedition. And having raised them, the ivories required immediate conservation. Unfortunately, we do not know what he did. W.K. Loftus, who found a horseload of heavily burnt ivories in what is now known as the Burnt Palace, boiled his in gelatin. It's perhaps at this moment fair to say that Layard similarly refused to acknowledge the achievements of Loftus, as he would not Cooper. Perhaps he just happened to be a rather jealous man, jealous of his great endeavours. However, it seems probable that Layard also conserved the ivories in the same way, and it is noteworthy that all his ivories, which we see today in the British Museum, are in a stable state. You can pick them up without being terrified they're going to disintegrate on you. And just how excellent the state of preservation is can be proved by comparing the ivories today with the watercolour drawings made of them in 1848 by Edward Prentice, referred to by John Curtis. And if you look, you'll see that not a single fragment that was drawn by Prentice is missing 160 years later. I think that's proof of just how successful the conservation was. And while talking of the watercolour drawings made by the various artists, I should like to note that all the ones that have been recently discovered were found by Dr. Curtis, I think on eBay or some unlikely place, which I'm sure he'll tell us more about if we ask him. Another of Layard's outstanding achievements were his publications, and these appeared speedily at many levels, from detailed publication as early as 1852. Popular versions, such as his popular 1854 book of A Popular Account of Discoveries at Nineveh, right down to one of Murray's railroad reading copies, copies of which were widely available in all the sorts of public libraries at the time. Layard wrote brilliantly, and his books included accounts of his many adventures as well as his discoveries. They remain an entertaining read today, as well as when they were first published. As I began, I think Layard was a hero. The late Richard Barnett was the first scholar to undertake a serious study of the ivories found by Layard and Loftus at Nimrud. Magisterial catalogue of the Nimrud ivories was published a century after their discovery. Let us leave the last words to him to describe Layard's astonishing contribution to archaeology. Layard as an excavator was little less than a prodigy. Fortunate in possessing initial assets, a high courage and determination, rare powers of observation and description, a powerful physical constitution, a sympathetic knowledge of Oriental languages, ways and peoples, a remarkable skill in draftsmanship. Untrained, without predecessors except Botta, without guidance other than his native ability, young and usually single-handed in a wild and unhealthy country, Layard achieved more than any other man has ever since done in the same field, and set a standard of scientific efficiency, almost always serviceable, compared with which the work at Nimrud and elsewhere of those on whom his mantle fell showed for many decades only a sad degeneration.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit in advance, actually, so we can start with the discussion and questions, etc. And I would say we have two options. Either you, the speakers of this morning, come here and answer questions, or we can make it less. How would I say, less formal, and whoever wants can ask questions to those who presented their papers this morning. So, please, wants to start? Yes, of course. Just 1 second, because we have to take the...
I'd like to thank all the speakers this morning. Extraordinarily interesting. But I have two general questions I think I'd like to ask all the speakers. And one of them is about Layard's ambition as an archaeologist. Professor Herrmann and Andrew George spoke about his formation in a way. But what remains totally mysterious to me is why Nineveh and Nimrud? Did he, as a young person, have a tremendous fascination and want to go out and discover them? Or was it just by chance, was it by serendipity that this young, enthusiastic, ambitious person went to this part of the world? And why this kind of archaeology? Why not other parts of the ancient world? That's my first question. And my second question, which predicts a bit what might happen this afternoon, is there any trace in, all of you talked about his relationship with draftsmen and people who recorded things, and this comes through again in another part of his life with the Arundel Society in Italy, which recorded all these extraordinary works of art which were severely damaged in the Risorgimento. And but he was there working with women whom he got along with very well. And so it was a different relationship with the sort of artists who were recording things. But and then in Professor Herrmann's paper, what came out very much was a sort of connoisseurship about ivories and his concern for restoration, which was hard to define. And Professor Herrmann mentioned Giovanni Morelli, who's of some interest to me. And he, of course, invented what's called connoisseurship, but he was also deeply involved, and part of connoisseurship was conservation. So my second question is there any suggestion of connoisseurship in this early archaeology? Come? Non si sente? Non hai sentito niente? Va bene, la seconda domanda è che ci sono evidenze di connoisseurship nella sua maniera di archeologia. Se ci sono intimazioni, come per esempio dopo con la società Arundel, con la sua conservazione dei monumenti italiani, che sono la stessa cosa nell'archeologia. Chiaro la domanda? Troppo complessa?
I can only deal with the first question, I think, which is, as far as I can recall, it was Layard's encounter in Mosul with the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta, and with the landscape that he saw in Mosul. Botta, I remember, had been sent as French consul to Mosul, but with the explicit idea of excavating a mound. And this was something an idea which came to Layard then as something he should do. And when he went down, when he was resident in Mosul, he saw the mounds of Kiundrik and Nebin Yunus across the river, and he explored them on foot. And then when he went down the river to Baghdad, he saw looming on the left bank the great ruin of Nimrud, and there he conceived, as Georgina read out, this desire grew in him to come back and excavate it one day. So I think it was the combination of learning that other people were interested, and in finding the sites themselves so intriguing, that drove him to eventually come back and excavate.
Well, perhaps you'll be better on connoisseurship. I couldn't begin to address it. But I think we're going to hear more tomorrow about Layard's ambitions and his political and diplomatic ambitions. I think it's certainly true that as a young man in London, there's no evidence that he was particularly interested in archaeology. But then during his early travels in Iran, he did actually write quite a lot about the Elamite reliefs, Neo-Elamite reliefs that he encountered, and about the great site of Susa. So he did, and this was in his so-called travels with the Bakhtiari tribes, so he did have some interest, and he writes actually very informatively about the reliefs, quite remarkable for the time, I must admit. So he did have some interest in archaeology and ancient history and so on by the time he got to Nimrud, and as Andrew says, he did see Botta's excavations, and then when he was in Istanbul with Stratford Canning, they did see all Botta's drawings passing through Constantinople on their way to Paris. So that triggered his interest. But I think, in answer to your question, in the first place, I don't think he ever intended to set out to be an archaeologist. I think probably, as we might hear tomorrow, he was more interested in becoming a diplomat, something like that. And that's probably why in early travels he spends so much time describing the political situation in southwestern Iran. That's really what most of the book is all about. But then, obviously, he caught his interest and attention, the excavations, and he made a huge success of it.
Perhaps also his determination to work at Nimrud was worried because he went down the Tigris and saw Nimrud and Ashur on a separate thing before the second. And what he noticed was that the site of Nimrud could immediately Well, it was because he identified it as where Xenophon had marched by on the Great Retreat, and he could identify the site of Nimrud immediately, and he writes about it in one of those books which I haven't quoted from. That will be done. Oh, he was phenomenal. He really was. And you'll find, actually, if you some of the people who excavated in the late 50s at Fort Shalmaneser, you'll find that many of them were having similar difficulties in raise these very fragile ivories. But the British conservation at that time was different. We used impregnating it with a polyvinyl and, remember what else, John? Began with tea. All the ivories were stuck in. Actually, if you look at them today, it's undoubted that the method used by Layard Loftus was much more successful because some of the ones found by the British expedition are.
I don't want to be the person that's always being negative, but I have to say that with regard to the Nimrud bowls, Layard describes in Nineveh and Babylon how he extracted them using his penknife with great difficulty. Stuart Rolland, in a dispatch to the Times, says that he excavated them.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, in relation to the discovery of Nineveh and the interest, I don't think we should forget that other people had been interested in it before. It's not as if it was a complete blank slate. And particularly, I wanted to mention Claudius Rich. I don't know if you know about Claudius Rich, but he was a British agent in Baghdad for 13 years, 1808 to 1821. And he was very interested in Kurdistan, and indeed was the first to appreciate the political significance of Kurdistan for the British in 1819, 1820. And he went to Kurdistan and he wrote quite a lot about Nineveh in a book which was published in 1836, Narrative of a Residence in Kurdistan, which was published through the agency of his widow, and also Sir James Mackintosh, who was her father, who was one of the most distinguished historians of the age. And they were very influential in the British Museum setup. And indeed, if you go into the Asian and African Studies room of the British Library today, which used to be the India Office Library, you will see, the first thing you will see is a portrait of Claudius Rich, who was regarded as the father of interest in all these areas. So I think that Laird and a lot of other people would have read about Rich in Nineveh in the late 1830s. So I just wanted to say that. That's not to diminish.
Read Rich's works before he left. I think we don't know that.
The colleagues had already answered the first question, so I would only like to add that, as we have already heard, the Layard's interest in Asia Minor depends on his stay in Constantinople during the 40s, before he started his excavations in Mesopotamia. And we know that during these years he traveled a lot, and he had a direct knowledge of the territory. So I would like to say he didn't have a real interest in archaeological excavation on surveys in this period, in this territory, but he got a really very good knowledge of this area, and so that's all.
Hello to everyone. I hope I don't disturb with an incursion but thank you very much for the organizers and for all the speakers. It was very, very interesting. And I had the occasion of writing a paper on British explorers and spies in Central Asia in the 18th century especially. And to me, Layard, his figure had very much similarities but many differences with another figure of explorer and spy, who was Charles Maston in Afghanistan. And it's roughly the same period. And the two characters are quite similar because they both went on foot, exploring, dressed as dervishes or as, like with oriental dresses, disguised as locals. But to me, it looks more like Masson was a deserter of the East India Company army, and he was a critic of British foreign expansion in Afghanistan, especially of hawkish politics, of the Afghan War of 1838 and 1842. And Layard, I was wondering if all speakers could answer this question, was he like sort of ideologist of British imperial expansion, or was also critical of it? I'm sorry, my English, maybe I've lost it after university in London, but too much time spent in Venice probably, but I don't know if my question was clear, but I'm happy to discuss further. Yeah, thank you.
I can't really answer your question, but several people have written about that aspect of Layard, whether he was an agent of British foreign policy. It's true. But with regard to Charles Masson in Afghanistan, I think the thing about him is that he didn't write nearly as much as Layard did, so it's only now that his achievements are being brought to light. There have been several catalogues of him recently done in the British Museum by somebody called Elizabeth Errington. And there's no doubt he did a lot of work and found a lot of material and made some important contributions to the history of Afghanistan. But I'm not really prepared to answer your question about Layard's quasi-imperial role. Perhaps somebody else could. Maybe you could.
I do actually think, I have a theory that Stratford Canning sent Laird to Kurdistan in 1845, partly because it was a very disturbed area after the massacre of the Nestorians in 1843 by the Kurds. And I think the British were very concerned about the stability of the area because of the Turco-Persian border and the difficulty that created for Anglo-Russian relations, because it was the most unstable area, potentially in the Near East, after the settlement of 1841, which had stabilized most of the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So they were very concerned about making sure that things were kept quiet. And I think that Layard's presence there was one way of doing that. I think that it was very interesting, and I wanted to pick up what John was saying about the uniforms of the different tribes who excavated, because he was employing a lot of Nestorians, Christians, but he was also employing a lot of Arabs. And I've always been curious to know how he managed that relationship between the two. But I do think that he was very concerned to keep them amicable and also to keep the Kurds amicable. And he spent a lot of time giving hospitality to the locals and making sure that they understood that the British were not insignificant in the area. I'm not saying it was entirely successful, and I wouldn't myself call that imperialism, but some people do.
Other questions? So if not, we can stop now, and we will resume in the afternoon after lunch at 3 o'clock sharp. And yeah, I think there are some changes in the afternoon's program. You can maybe.
Yeah, so Professor Falles won't be able to join us tomorrow, but he sent his paper, which will be read by Francesca in the afternoon. So Francesca will read after my presentation at 3:40 in the afternoon, and Dr. Barovier-Mentasti will talk tomorrow instead of Falles, so at 11:10. That's the change that it's going to be. Yeah. So that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. So see you at 3 o'clock.